So in this discussion, we're going to look at the question of ethics in the publication field. There are three reasons why we're focusing on this. One is that ethics is different in the field of publication than it is in some of the issues that you may have faced as graduate students, particularly regarding plagiarism. Second of all, ethics illustrates how papers extend beyond their publication date, since ethical violations can be launched any time after a paper is published. And third, the sanctions that writers may face when they're accused of ethical violations may be different with published articles than they were as you may have encountered as graduate students. So ethics covers a broad range of relationships in the publication process. There are ethical issues regarding the author of the paper. There are ethical issues regarding the editor of the journal. There are ethical issues regarding peer reviewers in the journal. And there are ethical issues regarding the publishers of the journal. So in each case, the role of editors, peer reviewers, staff, readers, and publishers all are going to look at certain ethical issues, and often employing a variety of technological tools to see if they can ferret out some violations. What ethics is considered may vary a great deal across disciplines and regions. It's also part of the evaluation process that, as I said, goes on after the publication process. Along with citing the sources, authors can be charged with ethical violations at any point. How ethics violations are reported can differ a lot, obviously, than what you may have faced in grad school when you were really primarily concerned with what your teacher thought. Ethical violations are often reported by readers who may notice things when they encounter the article, and then they can report those to the journal or to the university. Investigations of ethics can take a long time. And they're much differently handled at Ohio State, for example. There's a committee on ethics that looks at ethical violations, which is much different than the often very fast kind of jury trial that students may have when they're accused of either plagiarism or sending the same papers to different courses. Often they could consider different factors such as sloppiness of the paper as opposed to doing outright deceit. In all the cases, authors are often considered to be stewards of their data. So there was a case, for example, at my university where the student had made certain claims about the data regarding pornography on the internet. The data was then analyzed, and once the data was analyzed, it was considered that the student had made up the claims and was sanctioned severely. Often ethical violations, then often either a paper can be retracted or corrected, and these issues are going to never be particularly clearly stated as to how they're doing. Often, for example, papers that are retracted may have been cited numerous times before the retraction goes out. They do obviously have an impact on the writing process and the publishing process, particularly in terms of what the author, when you submit a paper for publication, you're going to be responsible for a number of ethical considerations right off the bat in terms of what you tell the editor of the paper. There's a number of questions of authorship this is going to raise as to who you consider to be an author. That's why journals often require you to send in notification that all of the authors on your paper have signed off on it, so that if one author may have done some ethical violations, all the authors will be responsible. And this has become a very important problem, and that's why you see more and more cases of ethical violations, and also more and more kind of constraints particularly when you contact the editor and submit the paper. There are more and more kind of questions you need to ask or answer about your ethics. So I'm going to look at a number of examples. Most of these come from a blog that I consult a lot called Retraction Watch, and they're meant to really show a number of different kinds of ethical violations that authors often face. In the first example, citation manipulation, journal retracts paper because author boosted reference to the journal he edits. And that's a little complicated because one of the things that we've discussed doing is make sure you cite references to the journal to demonstrate you're familiar with the journal. But in this case, the editor of the journal added citations in order to make the journal look better and ultimately give it a higher impact factor. The second one is about reproduction. Okay, now this is where an example of where fields can vary a great deal, because in some fields simply being able to reproduce the information gives it a certain authority, but in other fields reproduction is impossible. So being unable to reproduce the results may be a violation in some fields, and it may not be a concern in other fields. In the third example, a journal has retracted a 2012 paper about where the last author was unable to provide material to support the results. And so this again is an example of what we call data stewardship, where the authors were responsible for the data that they were going to present, and when they couldn't support their claims with the data, the paper had to be retracted. In the fourth example, has to do with conflicts of interest, where the authors receive a grant. And again, that's one of the reasons why now when you submit a paper for publication, you have to notify the editor whatever money you've received, and if you have any conflicts of interest. And this is obviously more of a case in some fields where you might be supported commercially, or in other fields there are no possible conflicts of interest. The last one is an example of what ethical consideration and peer review. The peer reviews are considered to be provide important important feedback to the author, and if they don't do that, they're considered to be inadequate. In this group of examples, we're going to look at the problems with the process of writing that might result in ethical violations. In the first example, it has to do with the IRB. I'm not a big fan of IRBs because often they seem not to be particularly related to my work, but they are often required, and sometimes if they find out you don't have an IRB and you did some work that might be controversial, the fact that you didn't have the IRB, or you didn't you changed your IRB, you changed the research, could be consideration an ethical violation. Sensitive patient information in the second one. So ethical violations in regard to your subjects is a very consideration in terms of judging ethics. This is particularly true when you're working with children, but in all cases you have to be aware of whenever you have human subjects, you have an additional level of ethical consideration. In the third example, also had to do with who could access the paper and whether accessing the paper was sensitive, critical information. And again, this shows some of the sensitivity that publishers have about what kinds of papers are being published. Causing a paper publication causing distress is in the fourth example, could also be considered a grounds for retraction. The issue in the fifth one about vaccines and autism illustrates the issue about when you publish something, if you do get to publish something on a topic that's highly controversial, it still could be subject to scrutiny after the paper is published. If many people find your findings to be controversial or not in line with the existing thought in the field. Image manipulation. That's one we don't cover a whole lot in the course, but this is an area of great sensitivity since those of you particularly who work with figures and images have to be very sensitive, and of course the case of in Ohio State often did sometimes revolve around the use of images and whether the images from one paper could be used in another, and whether images then could then be manipulated in order to support the data. So all of these issues, again, the point is if you ever feel or concerned that you may be in violation of an ethical issue, then you need to contact the editor and express your concern for whatever ethical violation you may have had. What kind of punishments do authors have? Well, the most common one is retraction or having to resubmit the paper. Some authors are told you can never submit a paper to that journal again, and often they're reported to the university, although it's never clear what the university does. And so there are a couple of examples here about a researcher who lost 11 retracted papers and then he lost his job. And a second example of a kidney researcher who also lost a professorship for data manipulation. And he lost 2 papers to retraction and also then lost his job as well. Now, if you find a mistake in your own paper, you can retract it yourself. And so here's some examples of one researcher who found an error in their calculation on the spreadsheet. A second researcher retracted a paper after they didn't realize that they had already submitted the paper. And then a third researcher, a Nobel laureate, had retracted a paper when he decided his conclusions were not correct. So one of the important considerations that this discussion of ethics focuses on is who is an author of the paper. A lot of times people may list authors or not list authors who should have been on the paper, and someone might claim that they're actually the author. This is a dispute that often occurs, particularly between graduate students and faculty, and particularly when someone moves from one lab to another. Often faculty blame graduate students and postdocs for any errors they have. That's why when you submit a paper, you have to be sure that everyone signs off on it. That's why they're asking to sort of get away from this blame game that sometimes authors play. Ghost authors refer to authors who don't really contribute anything to the paper and who may have been put on the paper. Again, that's going to be a problem now, more so than it was years ago, because those authors could be still held responsible for what's published. And some authors, sometimes papers will add authors to make them look good. Obviously, there's some cases where there may be 1,000 authors, and obviously they did not write anything on the paper, but they may have contributed to the research. Still, they are responsible. So even if the author didn't contribute anything, then they may not warrant being on the paper because they cannot say whether the paper is accurate or not. Another issue we've discussed this semester that also relates to ethical considerations is textual ownership. borrowing your student's paper if you're a faculty member. I once gave that as an assignment to students to consider that, and many of the graduate students were concerned about it, but were also concerned that if they said anything, the faculty sponsor might get upset with them and cut off their grants, and they were more concerned about losing grants than they were about having their work stolen. And other students felt that if they worked in a lab, the work belonged to the professor who sponsored the lab, and therefore he had or she had a right to the paper. So all of these can raise ethical considerations. Sometimes authors, even though they're supposed to sign off before, they don't always agree as to what the problem is, and that could lead to retraction. The journal might say, okay, we'll find out what the problem is, and if they can't decide on the problem, the journal just went ahead and retracted the paper. And also, plagiarism is still a concern. It's an ethical issue, although again, it's often difficult to define exactly what plagiarism is. So plagiarism in publication may not be exactly the same as plagiarism in your courses, in part because some concerns are different in terms of whether you can copy previously published methodologies, for example, or other areas of the paper that may be too close. It's never really clear. This is why you have to be very careful whenever you use material from another paper, whether it's your paper or someone else's paper. Sometimes it's just blatant. They copy the paper directly from another paper. And again, remember that many publishers use some of the tools like Turnitin in order to discover how much copying there was. So papers are often retracted for plagiarism. And again, even though it's not quite as defined as clearly in publication as it might have been before, you still need to kind of be aware of some of the issues regarding copy. There are other issues related to intellectual property law. The DMCA notice, DMCA refers to the Digital Media Copyright Act, and that is what people cannot violate if they want to, if they want to not get accused of being violating intellectual property. This is a law that YouTube uses a lot to take down papers that somebody may consider to be in violation of intellectual property. Illustrations are often subject to these kinds of issues. These are very complicated issues in terms of illustrations, and you can see in the final example that there's the magazines can even have similar covers and may be in violation. This is never clear, and often it takes some kind of arbitration. We see the same a lot when musicians, for example, go to court, or authors go to court, and someone claims that their work was violated intellectual property. It's a complicated issue, and you just have to be very careful about it. Personally, I think the most serious violation is falsification, because in that you have to kind of deliberately be cheating by presenting incorrect information. Data manipulation and the way data is presented is a very serious question, and how the data was collected, how the data was stored, how the data was interpreted to yield a particular result. These are all possible areas where, if you're not cited for, say, misinterpreting, or in some ways you could also be cited for ethical violations. Probably the worst is simply to fake the data. Um, and that's also a case, and that's very serious in this fake HIV vaccine, particularly in the idea that it didn't have the kind of results that the paper claimed it had. So I think in overall, those kinds of situations are much bigger concern, I think, than many others in terms of what's considered to be an ethical violation.